So today on the podcast, we'll continue our news stories for the month. At the heart of today's episode, we'll begin to explore the new offerings out of the Florida resort. This past week, the Starlight Parade opened, as did the remade Test Track, what is generally being called Test Track 3.0, as it's the third distinct version of this ride. And I'll put this up front. The new parade has some fans and also some detractors. I've seen the parade now 5 times from various places in the Magic Kingdom. On this parade, I personally am following a little more on the fan of it side, but there are shortcomings. I can see both sides of the issue here, and we'll get into all of the nuances in a little bit. And notice I said we'll begin to discuss the new offerings, as it's going to take us a couple of episodes to get through all of this in its entirety. Simply, there are too many news stories and too many new experiences in Florida right now to cover in one episode. So here's our structure for both this week and for next week's podcast, to cover a couple of news stories each week, and then also each week to cover half of the stories about the new experiences in Florida. Early to midsummer is usually a slow time for corporate news, but as we move toward the later parts of summer, the news cycle for Disney typically starts to pick up again. Simply, big announcements tend not to happen as much in June or July, while key executives at Disney, or really at any company, take some time off for family vacations. Still, even during these slow months, Disney moves forward. And with that, I have a couple of updates about film and other divisions before we get into the news centered on Florida. And I'll also put this up front. The various openings in Florida, the parade, the ride, and some other new elements beyond them, together represent a tonal shift in direction for the American Disney parks, something that surprised me a little. A shift in tone that is oddly targeted at the center of the fan community, as though Disney is keying a little bit more into what's actually going to satisfy longtime fans rather than families on those once-in-5 years or once-in-a-lifetime vacations to Orlando, which is the sweet spot, or at least it has been for various Disney park projects. That is, elements of multiple projects recently opened seem to suggest that Disney might have reevaluated actual visitation patterns and come to the realization that, well, right now at least, the repeat visitor is a little more valuable than they had assumed a few years ago. That is, there are elements in all of the new offerings that are specifically arranged to speak to the repeat or frequent visitor, which makes me think that something lies beneath this, such as, in a post-pandemic, post-revenge travel economy, Disney has now placed a slightly higher valuation on the repeat or frequent visitor, essentially on the fan. But before we get to all of that, we have a couple of shorter news updates, and as it's still summer, I think these updates are essentially a prelude to fall, when no doubt we'll see more movement within the company, likely around some of these same issues. So with that, let's kick into it and get to today's stories. First up today is a mid-year update to Disney's theatrical releases for 2025. Months ago, when we started looking at Disney's 2025 slate of upcoming films, we suggested that Lilo and Stitch and the Fantastic Four would be the first 2 large hits for Disney this year. Moreover, we had suggested that of the 3 Marvel films released so far this year, in terms of the financials, they would perform in the following order. Brave New World would have the lowest box office and wouldn't turn around the MCU, Thunderbolts would do better but wouldn't be the breakout hit, and Fantastic Four would finally be a film that could move Marvel Studios out of its multi-year post-Endgame slump. As I record this, Fantastic Four has just shown up in theaters, and the projections on this film suggest that it's going to do just fine and will reach far beyond the core MCU fan base. The unexpected element in all of this is actually its competition. James Gunn's Superman has done surprisingly good business, and by the end of this weekend, and by that I mean July 27th, it should have taken in close to $500 million worldwide. The money from Superman was enough to move its studio Warner Brothers ahead of Disney in terms of overall box office take for the year, at least so far. Disney will likely retake that top spot next week with Fantastic Four, but the combination of these two fairly optimistic superhero movies, Superman and Fantastic Four, might mean that the superhero slump of the last few years is finally over. Or at least I'm pretty sure that both Disney and Warner Brothers executives will see the combined strength of these two movies as a reason to be hopeful about subsequent superhero offerings. In terms of Disney's overall release strategy, I'm still holding to my original prediction from months ago. Disney still has too many theatrical films in the market this year, which is creating a boom and bust cycle. Audiences are coming to the best produced, best received films while staying away from the more modestly reviewed fare. The biggest example of the boom or bust scenario is between Elio and Lilo and Stitch, which were released within a month of each other. Elio, released on June 18th, made just $131 million worldwide, while Lilo and Stitch, released 4 weeks earlier, took in over $1 billion. One is a significant financial success, and the other has produced a significant loss. The film's release schedule overlapped a little bit and were in theaters for some of the same weeks. But I'd say this problem here is more an effect of delayed competition rather than head-to-head competition. Or to put it simply, when Elio came out, it was easy for parents to say, "We just went to the movies a couple of weeks ago." And also, Elio doesn't look quite as intriguing or as familiar as Stitch. And small issues like this are having a significant effect on box office earnings, with one film here taking in a tremendous amount of money and the other not even covering its production costs. Or consider this. Pixar's Elio, which is an enjoyable film, made less money than Pixar's Onward, a movie that was released 2 weeks before the world shut down for COVID and then had to be yanked out of near-empty theaters as nearly all businesses closed down. To be fair, Elio does have some story problems, which I would say are partially due to significant changes in the script, overall messaging, and casting as it was moving through production. We've talked about all of this before. But Elio is not a film that, based solely on quality, should make just 10% of what Stitch pulled in. I'd put this down to 3 things. First, the element of delayed competition. Second, a script that was slightly weakened to the point that it didn't fully wow the audience. And third, sadly, the film is focused on a new set of characters. In 2025, familiarity simply almost always outsells the unfamiliar. Beyond this, pre-pandemic trends have simply deepened. Audiences are still coming out to big tentpole films and also to films in an ongoing franchise. And I don't think a larger or more robust set of annual releases is going to undo these trends. Personally, I do wish that mass audiences were more open to new properties, new stories, new characters, but clearly that's just not where we are right now in terms of the box office. There will be an occasional non-franchise film that is a breakout hit, but scenarios like this are becoming more difficult to achieve and typically only happen with stellar scripts, stellar casting, and stellar directing. I'm sure what Disney is trying to do this year is this. As a company overseeing a set of unique studios, Disney is experimenting with release schedule options to figure out the strategy that maximizes its total profit. Even back during the days of Walt, he was aware of these patterns. Walt more than once commented that some of his films didn't perform as well as he hoped at the box office, while others would do fabulous business. The goal then is not to scrutinize individual films, but to look at the release slate as a whole in terms of calculating total profit or loss for the set. The key in 2025 and moving forward is figuring out how many and which types of films in production should go out to theatrical and which should go out to streaming. Every studio has hits and busts, but my sense is the far larger slate of Disney films this year is causing the company's second-tier releases to underperform, as they are partially eclipsed by a neighboring Disney film released roughly in the same month. But again, figuring out how a post-pandemic, streaming-centered audience now works is going to take some trial and error. Last year, the release schedule was too thin, and this year, at least in my opinion, too broad. But I'm pretty sure that right now, Bob Iger is pretty happy to be able to discuss Stitch and the Fantastic Four on the next quarterly earnings call early in August as a way of deflecting from some films that had issues at the box office earlier this year, such as Elio, Snow White, and maybe even Brave New World. That is, in terms of Disney's theatrical releases, I'm pretty sure we're through the most troubling part of the year, and the second half, starting with Lilo and Stitch, is going to look a lot better. On the horizon, we have Freakier Friday, a film with a modest budget that will hit the nostalgia button for many viewers, and heads up, more on that nostalgia button later. We also have Tron Ares, part of a franchise that has never been able to find a breakout hit. I would say that Tron is the possible problem spot for fall, even though Disney clearly would like to have a near-future franchise to support both the studio and also to support Tomorrowland areas in its parks. Look at it this way: Disney has films that support most other areas of its castle parks, except for Tomorrowland. And then, at the end of the year, we have Zootopia 2 and Avatar 3, two films that should do very well at the box office. And that, in terms of theatrical, is where we are right now. And now, in the world of Disney, copyright versus trademark. Earlier this year, we discussed that the earliest Mickey Mouse films were moving into the public domain, such as Steamboat Willie. We also discussed back then that there was an unusual legal situation surrounding the mouse's early design and its shift into public domain. First, public domain is only absorbing the initial design of Mickey, at least right now, and of other early Disney characters as they appeared in 1928. For example, Ub Iwerk's presentation of Mickey and Steamboat Willie is different from the far more familiar Freddie Moore redesign of Mickey, with the white pupils and more rounded facial features that appeared in the late 1930s, which is worlds away from the version of Mickey as he appeared in the more recent Wonderful World of Mickey Mouse cartoons overseen by Paul Ruddish. Beyond this, in the shift to public domain, there was also an unusual legal catch. Typically, when intellectual property moves into public domain, such as the famous American novel The Great Gatsby that has sold over 30 million copies, which also recently shifted to public domain, the public can then adapt or reuse the material as they like. For example, you are all free now to write your own Great Gatsby sequels or to print and sell your very own leather-bound versions of Gatsby as it was written by its original author, F. Scott Fitzgerald. For that matter, Disney is free to make a film in which, let's say, Ant-Man travels back in time to save Gatsby from the quivering gun held by the deeply wounded and misguided George Wilson. Not that I recommend Disney doing this, but they simply have the legal right to do that now that The Great Gatsby is in the public domain. The fictional Ant-Man, aka Scott Lang, could now meet the fictional Jay Gatsby in an attempt to save his life. And perhaps the twist in this movie might be that Ant-Man, back when he was in high school and not the best student, never really finished reading The Great Gatsby for his junior-level lit class, which now causes problems because Ant-Man doesn't know where he's supposed to find George Wilson in the lead-up to Gatsby's death. But back to my main point. Mickey Mouse is not like Gatsby. Mickey isn't only managed by copyright law, the character's image is also managed as a company trademark. Trademarks can be renewed every 10 years, and so long as they're in active use, they can be renewed indefinitely. And back at the beginning of this year on our podcast, we suggested that it would be interesting to see how or if Disney might try to use trademark protections to manage how other companies use the 1928 public domain version of the mouse in their products or productions. Well, we now have an answer to that question. Earlier this month, Disney filed a lawsuit in federal court that the jewelry company Sator, which is owned by Red Earth Company of Hong Kong, is violating Disney's trademark as it pertains to Mickey Mouse with Sator's line of Mickey Mouse jewelry, even though Sator clearly points these products towards the version of Mickey that has passed into public domain. Sator even calls this line the Mickey Mouse 1928 collection. But Disney is claiming that the Mickey Mouse 1928 collection produced by Sator causes confusion in the marketplace and may lead consumers to believe that the Sator offerings are either an official or an officially licensed Disney product. In short, the company claims that Sator is identifying its products in a way that ties them to the Disney brand and to the protected trademark elements of the Disney company, specifically its iconic ambassador, Mickey Mouse. So here's the subtle distinction. Companies can use the 1928 version of Mickey Mouse, but not in a way that suggests the product might be tied to products that could have been produced or licensed by the Disney company. I sort of suspect that Disney lawyers have been sifting through all of the 1928 Mickey Mouse merchandise that has come out in the last few months from other companies, and if my Facebook feed is any indication, there's a lot of it here, until they found a company where they felt fairly sure they could successfully engage a trademark lawsuit, likely as a warning or simply as a way to scare away other companies considering using the 1928 version of Mickey in their products. But it will be interesting to see how this lawsuit plays out. I'm not familiar with any previous lawsuit that wanted to define the intersection of trademark protections concerning a drawn character whose early works have now passed into public domain. So this suit has the potential to define exactly what rights the Disney company can still exert over early versions of the mouse as they move forward, and this will soon apply to other characters such as Pluto, Donald, Goofy, and then Snow White. There are still more general news stories to explore next week, but now we're up to the lead-in for our featured segment in this episode, which I want to call Everything Old is New Again, because not only are there new additions at Disney World, there appears to be a new sentiment partially guiding their development. You've probably heard there's some new or revamped attractions that recently debuted at Disney World, such as the Starlight Parade and Test Track 3.0. I've seen or experienced both of them multiple times now. We'll talk about them, some this week and some next week. But I want to ease us into this discussion from an unusual angle, specifically from a fairly large surprise announcement that Disney made this past Tuesday. Disney will redo the animation courtyard at Hollywood Studios to bring back an updated version of the Magic of Disney Animation tour. This was many decades ago, an opening day experience at Disney MGM Studios. It had a film presentation, examples of hand-drawn animation, and then, at least initially, a look inside of a working animation studio. Guests could walk by large fishbowl windows and see down into the studio space where artists were working on Mulan, the original Lilo and Stitch, Brother Bear, and so on. Disney closed its animation studio in Florida a couple decades ago, so this new experience will not involve guests watching a full animation studio at work, but it is a nod to the old Disney MGM Studio Park, a subtle suggestion that what was originally in this space was more satisfying than those things that have replaced it. Specifically, I'm thinking here of Launch Bay, which is using part of the old animation tour space. To be honest, I do think there's likely another element in play here. Specifically, company executives are looking around the Florida resort to see what new experiences can be in place to anchor a 2026 mid-year ad campaign, because right now, in terms of marketing, there's very little to hit that spot. A Mando redo of Smuggler's Run and the Tree of Life redo with Zootopia, though that will be advertised as winter 2025. Beyond this, the resort is relying heavily on entertainment to produce new shows and parades to fill the gap before Tropical Americas can open, hopefully in 2027. Live entertainment is being pushed so hard here to complete projects quickly that some appear not quite ready when they debut, and more on that in a bit. But to get back to my main point, even if company execs were looking for a new attraction or entertainment options that they could open with a year, they likely had multiple options to consider. That is, the company is consciously pivoting back to revise and update an older attraction, and this says three things. First, the initial version of Disney MGM might have had a better sense in some places as to what the public wanted. Second, Disney might be finally considering how new attractions and entertainment speak to the discrete theme of a specific park rather than just randomly dropping IP here and there. An animation studio at Hollywood Studios speaks to the core identity of this park. And third, lastly, Disney is finding a lot of value right now in hitting that nostalgia button pretty hard. The revised version of the studio tour is going to take its cue from the recent animated Disney short, Once Upon a Studio, which celebrates 100 years of Disney animation. The updated entrance to the animation tour building will feature Mickey's sorcerer hat as part of the facade, similar to how the sorcerer hat is configured at the Roy E. Disney building at the Burbank studio, which presently is home to Disney Animation and also a lot of office space. But this also points back to that big Mickey sorcerer hat that used to be at the center of the studio's park in Florida. The inside of the tour building will now resemble a working animation studio where all of the artists have presumably stepped away from their desks and work areas for a while, leaving us guests free to explore. From the description, it sounds like animated characters as projections or on screens will guide guests through the elements of an animation studio, from character design to animation to backgrounds to sound and so on, with stations where kids might experiment a little on their own. There will also be an area like the Animation Academy where guests as a group will be guided on how to draw a specific Disney character. A side note here, the animation experience, which is nearly identical to the drawing portion of the animation tour, is presently over at the Conservation Station at Animal Kingdom. Conservation Station is an expensive to maintain but rarely visited section of Animal Kingdom, so I do think that the likely shift of the animation class from Conservation Station back to Hollywood Studios might be a sign that conservation stations' days are now numbered. I see a likely scenario that as tropical Americas moves to open on one side of Animal Kingdom, Conservation Station on the other side might finally close. But anyway, back to the Hollywood Studios announcement. In addition to the tour and the group drawing classes and also the hat, this space will have a play area called Drawn to Wonderland, which will feature an oversized flower garden, a mad tea party, and Tugly Woods, largely inspired by the artwork of Mary Blair. The oversized garden from the section of the film where Alice shrinks down to the height where flowers tower over her sounds a lot like another attraction that was once at Disney MGM Studios, specifically the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids play area, where kids presumably were shrunk down to the size where flowers and, well, tall weeds towered over them as well. So this is another little push on that nostalgia button, and a tacit admission that the central attraction concepts that were once torn out of this park years ago may have been a little more successful than those offerings that replaced them. And before I could experience either the new parade or the revamped test track, I found another area where Disney was pushing on that nostalgia button pretty hard. I went out to Rivers of America to see how much work had been done there, as the area is now closed for the forthcoming Cars Land. As we speculated a couple months back, it's taking a while for construction fencing to go up around the sections of the park that face that river. It's a pretty wide stretch of land. It looks like there are two teams, one that started at Big Thunder and the other that started at the Haunted Mansion. The white section of construction fence that lines the mansion area and Liberty Square hasn't yet met up with the brown section of construction fence that lines the far end of Frontierland, roughly from Big Thunder up through the Country Bears. There's still an opening where you can see the river and island and Aunt Polly's, but that's going away soon. The Liberty Bell has been gone now for a couple of weeks, and the river when I was there 2 days ago was a little low, which makes me think that Disney has started to slowly drain it. But on the Frontierland portion of the construction fence were fictitious bills and posters artfully arranged to entertain bypassing guests. This is a common element on many construction walls at Disney. Presently over at Animal Kingdom, the construction walls around the old Dino Land have artwork showing the tropical America areas that will eventually open there. But here in Frontierland are a set of flyers and posters that all point to some fairly old and somewhat obscure Disney films from the 1970s. And this, too, is another way that the company is pushing down on that nostalgia button, largely for those people who are 50 years or older, to suggest that this resort is the place where their childhood still lives on. One of these posters advertises hundreds of acres of land for sale in the town of Silver Hill, Colorado. This is a reference to the 1972 Disney film Snowball Express, the story of a man who inherits a small and dilapidated ski resort and then decides after quitting his job to manage it. Then there's an advertisement for the Hard Times Cafe in Quake City. This is a reference to the 1975 film The Apple Dumpling Gang. And then there's another advertisement for Doc Terminus and his Miracle Cures, which is a reference to the 1977 film Pete's Dragon. There's even a poster advertising the Diamond Horseshoe Review, an opening day attraction at the Magic Kingdom that hasn't performed in decades. Again, an odd but interesting shift towards nostalgia to create engagement, nostalgia for older attractions, films, and theme park shows that have all disappeared into the wave of history. But this also, I think, is one of the key ways to understand some of the new attractions, venues, and entertainment that have recently shown up at the Florida resort. Offerings for, well, older guests that might invite them to think of pleasant memories they have of films and experiences from their youth. That is, Disney here is specifically targeting key elements in the park that have recently shown up to deep nostalgia for very regular Disney fans. And that moves us into our last segment for this week, which is about that Starlight parade that premiered a few days ago. In our last segment, I begin our discussion of Disney's Starlight, the new nighttime parade at the Magic Kingdom, a parade that has been in development of some kind for about 2 years but was only announced last August. Regular listeners know that Iger has felt pressure to quickly deliver new experiences, to create marketing anchors to promote the Florida resort, essentially filling the gap from the Chapek years, when ex-CEO Bob Chapek diverted profits away from robust park additions to backfill losses on the relatively new Disney streamer. And that bit of information that there was likely a rush beyond what Disney Live Entertainment could fully manage is going to be important in just a moment. Starlight is a nighttime parade in the tradition of the Main Street Electrical Parade and SpectroMagic. It's been nearly 10 years since a nighttime parade has graced Florida's Main Street. And even though I might quibble with some design and presentation decisions, it's lovely to have a parade back at the park at night. It turns the street area into a performance space. It focuses the mass audience so that everyone along the route has a shared experience. In terms of an entertainment format, a nighttime parade is somewhat like a concert. You can watch a video of a concert and find it not particularly interesting, which is partly because a video lacks the environmental and psychological energy of being in the audience, with everyone moving to the music, everyone's eyes angled up to see the band, and so on. A similar thing happens with a well-designed nighttime parade. The presentation provokes a vibe which unifies the crowd and transforms the area into something more than just people watching lighted floats. So if you've only seen the parade on video, it is a different experience viewing it inside the park. Also, it's difficult for video, particularly smartphone video, to pick up the light's full and true range of colors. And this is one of the elements that I most enjoyed about the parade. Its presentation of light is delicate and dappled and inviting. I might even say starry, which is a far better feel for a Castle Park parade, in my opinion, than the wall of bright color that defines many floats in the Paint the Night parade presently at Disneyland. I think the tones of Paint the Night more or less better fit DCA. But to get back to the Magic Kingdom, traditionally a Disney nighttime parade going back to 1972, when the Main Street Electrical Parade premiered in California, has 5 central components. And this is not an official list, rather a list I came up with by observing how Disney has defined the nighttime parade experience for the last 5+ decades. And here are those elements. First, large floats filled with spectacle and interesting mechanics that function as stages moving down the center of the street. Second, small, playful float units that often engage the audience with humor. As an example of this, think of those whirly ball units from SpectroMagic or the Doodlebugs from the Main Street Electrical Parade. Third, ground units of dancers whose moves are choreographed as they step down Main Street. Fourth, ground units of characters who engage the audience, often kids individually, to increase audience involvement. And lastly, a soundtrack whose orchestration tonally suggests that this presentation is different from entertainment found outside the park. A typical nighttime parade also requires probably 100 or more performers. So we'll look at what's working here and what also still needs some work. Let's start with the high points and the strength elements. Like some other recent additions to the Florida resort, this parade is steeped in moments of nostalgia. None of this is explained in person, so this is primarily there for those who remember earlier parades. Even though this musical bit is left off the online streaming soundtrack, the parade in person begins with the fanfare from the Main Street Electrical Parade. For longtime fans, this fanfare has gotta send shivers down the spine. Likewise, the parade features a version of the Baroque Hoedown, the easily recognizable theme melody from the Electrical Parade. The Blue Fairy unit a long time ago was the lead float in the Main Street Electrical Parade. A new version of the Blue Fairy float leads this parade. Probably the most memorable float, though, from the Main Street Electrical Parade was the Casey Jr. train that held some key Disney characters such as Goofy. That, too, is repeated here with a new, more technologically ambitious train. This train, too, has a name. Disney calls the train Whimsy, which was something that wasn't announced until a few weeks ago. And as a side note, I've got a little theory here. This train with its flat digital face looks a little like Thomas the Tank Engine, a character that Disney does not own. So I think maybe Disney decided that this train needed its own name to minimize any copyright confusion. But again, that's only a guess. And finally, as a nod to Spectro Magic, this parade ends with an animated image of Jiminy Cricket on the backside of the last float, which was more or less how Spectro Magic ended its performance. All of these areas are strengths. These elements are designed so that as guests watch the parade, well, the older guests anyway, the things they see are in dialogue, ideally with some cherished memories from many years ago. Again, this is how the nostalgia button works. It brings viewers into a space that they fondly remember from their youth and asks them to see the current parade through the window of those things that they witnessed a long time ago. There are 9 key floats in this parade, plus also a title float that only holds the name Disney Starlight. Some of these floats are absolutely fabulous. Whimsy, the train, is delightful, filled with energy and movement. The Peter Pan float is designed with a support system so the performers can fly out over the street. This is not presently working, or at least it wasn't working the 5 times I saw it, but when they do get it up and working, I expect it to be an impressive moment. The float theme to the movie Coco is the most colorful of the bunch, with a mechanical Pepita that rises up and breathes steam. The Royal Princess float, another throwback to the Main Street Electrical Parade, with its onboard waltzing characters, also has a lot of energy. But there are a couple of odd entries in the mix, what I would call minor quibbles. There's a float from the movie Wish, a film that neither did well at the box office nor on streaming, and whose characters are mostly unrecognizable to general park guests. If anything, this float suggests that Starlight was in production for a long time, and also suggests that Disney once held high hopes for this film. Also, the Frozen unit, which only features Elsa, is from Frozen 2. Again, a little bit of a head-scratcher, as the most memorable and iconic moments from that franchise are all in the first film. But all that aside, the floats as key concepts all work well. Back when the Main Street Electrical Parade first premiered, I think that was 53 years ago, technicians were still finishing off elements on the floats not long before they rolled out onto Main Street. And based here on some of the rather loose light lines on some of the floats, the Blue Fairy float in particular, I'm guessing something similar happened with Starlight. The original Main Street Electrical Parade, with some refurb and improvements, outgrew those issues, and I'm hoping the same can happen here. And even with limitations, these floats by themselves are impressive to see in person. So now let's get down into that list of 5 elements that have, by example, defined Disney nighttime parades and see what's working here and what's not. Area 1, large floats that function as stages. Well, there's 9 of them. Maybe I have quibbles about a couple, and maybe there was a rush to finish them, which in cases impacted quality. But overall, the 9 key rolling stages are working fairly well. Area 2, small, playful float units that often engage the audience with humor. In this parade, simply, there are none, and these are sorely missing. It's all grand moments without comedy in between, like those whirlybug floats or the doodlebugs. Area 3, ground units of dancers. Well, these are here, but there's not very many of them, nor are they well lit. They're mostly in dark costumes and have lighted props or nets of lights. That is, this area could add more to the parade, but again, clearly there seems to have been a rush to finish, and this is an area that can easily expand in later years, assuming there's a budget to do that. Area 4, ground units of characters who engage the audience individually. In the whole parade, there is just one character that walks up to the crowd. That is Tinkerbell. Tinkerbell walks ahead of the Peter Pan float, poses for photos, waves her illuminated wand at kids, and so on. And this is fabulous. The crowd eats it up. But there needs to be 20 or more arranged between floats throughout the parade. And lastly, Area 5, a soundtrack whose orchestration tonally suggests that this presentation is different from entertainment outside the park. I'm on board with this area as well. The original Main Street Electrical Parade soundtrack is better unified as it moves between float units, also more unique for the early 1970s, but I'm more than fine with the music for Starlight. In my opinion, it's better than the music for Paint the Night, which often reminds me of club culture that exists outside the park. I should also point out that there are significantly less than 100 performers in the parade, with most of the visual efforts focused on the floats themselves. But it's those absences overall, in ground units with characters, small floats focused on comedy, and a better use of the dance units, that makes the parade feel, well, not as finished as previous nighttime efforts. Still, there's some good structure. Maybe think of it all this way. Watching the parade in its present form is sort of like seeing all of the big special effects sequences in an Avengers movie without the connecting sections of comedy and small drama. And watching just those special effects sequences linked together would be still enjoyable, just not complete. A run of special effects sequences or a run of mostly just big floats gives us 1 or 2 tones over and over without letting the experience fill out with more comedy and quieter moments. And that's kind of the feeling here. All of the big structural moments are here in this parade, those long and in some cases very tall floats. But it's missing some of the elements that traditionally fill out a nighttime offering. It's possible that in the last few months, as things were clearly rushed based on the pushed-back opening of the parade, the emphasis was on finishing large floats, those moving stages, which again are the presentation backbone for any Disney parade. And then, possibly in the next year or so, some of those missing elements can be filled in. To be perfectly honest, I'm not sure this is how Disney World Operations is planning to spend part of their budget next year, but I do see the key structural elements for a strong parade here, with some areas that are still not fully fleshed out. And also, this is sort of how the Main Street Electrical Parade expanded and evolved over years. It grew with new floats and units multiple times in the 1970s after it premiered. And right here is where we are going to put a pin in our discussion. I've seen the parade 5 times, as I've mentioned, during its premiere week. I'm delighted to have a nighttime parade back in the park. There are strengths here, but also areas that aren't as developed as in previous parades. Most importantly, this nighttime parade changes the group energy dynamic in the park in positive ways. It gives the night a new vibe. And there are some key things that you should probably know if you want to see this parade in person. And even if it's not perfect, I think most of you will like it quite a bit. But this is where we are going to pick up our discussion next week as we continue to explore what I'm now calling Disney's Summer of Nostalgia, which plays out not only in these posters and this parade, but also in other elements that have recently arrived at the Florida resort. So today we covered updates on Disney's theatrical releases, trademark disputes on the Steamboat Willie version of Mickey Mouse, the announcement of a revised animation studio tour returning to Hollywood studios, the closing of Rivers of America, the move toward nostalgia engagement with construction posters and other elements at Disney World, and the premiere of the Starlight Parade at the Magic Kingdom. Next week, we'll continue our discussion of Starlight. We'll also take a look at Test Track 3.0 and the new lounge GO82 at Epcot. We'll also touch down on challenges for the Disney Plus streamer and some other things. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.